Finally, O God, renew them with the strength of your presence and the joy of helping to build a community worthy of the human person. We ask this as your sons and your daughters, confident in your goodness and your love. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm Sam Baker with KERA Radio. And before we get started, just want to review the rules a bit. They're fairly simple. We have 2 minutes for each opening statement from the candidates. And then for the questions that I will pose to them, there's a 90-second response for each candidate, and then a 45-second rebuttal for each candidate. And also any further response or follow-up, well, that's kind of up to me. As for the timekeeping, you'll notice there'll be about 4 boxes on the screen, and in one of those boxes will be the address where you can send questions for use in this debate. When the candidate gets down to about 15 seconds left in their answer, that box will turn yellow. And then when the time is up, it will turn red. We will also have 1-minute closing statements in the reverse order of opening. So in keeping with the agreement reached between the 2 candidates, the opening statement will go to Genevieve Collins.
Well, good evening, and thank you to the AJC for hosting us. Thank you to Congressman Allred for joining me and being flexible, rescheduling, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. This has been a tough year for all of us, and it's time that we come together. You know, I am born and raised here in Dallas. I went to school here. I've actually helped build a business here, and I've worked with every school district that makes up this congressional district. As a businesswoman, I've helped build my family business from 36 employees to now over 300 employees, serving 5 million students nationwide. And my company is focused on teaching kids how to read and do math to close the achievement gap in schools so that every child is prepared for a thriving future. As your Congresswoman, I'm going to focus on jobs, getting us back to work quickly and safely, on healthcare, protecting pre-existing conditions, and reducing the price of drugs. And at home, fully funding and supporting our police. Tonight, you'll hear my opponent talk about how bipartisan he is. Do not be fooled. In the reality, he votes with Nancy Pelosi 100% of the time. And he's an ineffective Washington party line politician who has passed 0 bills while he's been in office. And tonight you will hear him attempt to take credit for everyone else's work, whether it's the USMCA, the Garland VA, or a myriad of healthcare policies. My opponent has to stand for his record, which he votes with Nancy Pelosi 100% of the time. Just 2 weeks ago, he voted to defund the police by $600 million. He voted against sanctioning the Chinese Communist Party for practicing cyber espionage during the pandemic, and he supports raising taxes on our small businesses. These are not North Texas values, these are DC values. And Colin Allred believes that the federal government knows what to do better for your life than you do. I disagree. I look forward to a spirited and lively discussion. Thank you.
Now the opening statement from Congressman Colin Allred.
Well, thank you. And thank you to AJC and Temple Shalom and Rabbi Paley for hosting us this year. I'm sorry that we're not able to gather in person, but I hope we can still have a vibrant and lively discussion. It's been the honor of my life to represent my home in Congress these last 2 years. As many of y'all know, I was born and raised here by a single mother who was a public school teacher. My mom taught in our public schools, and we don't pay our teachers enough. So growing up here, it wasn't always easy. I was help. I had help from this, gave me a chance to go from school to Baylor University, to play in the NFL, to become a civil rights attorney, and to serve President Obama. And I'm proud of the work that I've done in my first term in Congress, and I'm proud of how we've done it. I'm proud that I led the effort to get the Garland VA hospital that's going to allow us to better serve 184,000 veterans and create 5,000 jobs. I'm proud that we passed the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement with my leadership that both business and labor have supported, and I think it's going to be a model for trade deals to come. I'm proud that I led the effort to pass to get a bullet train between Dallas and Houston, past the federal red tape holding it back, and have stood up for your healthcare and up against this administration when they tried to take it away. And I've done that while being endorsed by organizations.
Why don't we go ahead and ask a question to Ms. Collins, and then when Congressman Allred's able to return, we'll give him a chance to continue his opening statement.
Statement?
Yeah.
Okay. As you can tell, we are having tech problems, such as the case with live programming. So what we're going to do, just to continue things on, if you don't mind, Ms. Collins, and I'm sure you won't, I'm going to ask you a question while we wait for them to figure that all out. And then once we conclude with that, we'll go back to Congressman Allred, give him a chance to finish his opening statement, and then carry on with the questions in the order that we had. So anyway, recent events, you might say. The Senate Judiciary Committee vote on Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett is expected this week. Should that have waited until after the election?
Well, Sam, the reality is that Amy Coney Barrett is a phenomenal, well-qualified, well-respected, remarkably intelligent jurist who should be confirmed as a nominee. The Constitution under Article 2 stipulates that it is the executive branch's job to fill any vacancy in the Supreme Court. And it's imperative that we actually follow the Constitution as it stipulates what needs to happen in order to have an unbiased and appropriate unbiased and appropriate bench of justices. I believe that this is simply fulfilling our Constitution. And I also believe that Amy Coney Barrett is remarkably qualified. I am disappointed in the Democrat Party for trying to reconstitute what it means to follow the guidelines as outlined in Article 2. I'm disappointed that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and my opponent all say that we should pack the courts in case something of this nature happens. And I think that's wildly inappropriate. And it's our job to fulfill the Constitution, whomever is in the executive branch at the time. Sam, I believe you are muted.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Collins. This is all new to all of us here, so we're still figuring our way through this, all of us. It's a new reality here, thanks to the pandemic. But nevertheless, I believe we have Congressman Allred back with us. So, Congressman, if you would, we'd like to give you a chance to do your opening statement again.
Okay, Sam. Well, sorry about that. You know, obviously that's just the reality that we're living in now.
This is true.
That you have technical difficulties. And, you know, as I was saying, I'm proud of the work that I've done in my first term, and I'm proud of how we've done it. I led the effort and would not have happened without my leadership to get the VA hospital in Garland to serve 184,000 veterans and create 5,000 jobs. And I'm proud that I led the effort to help us pass the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement and even got a signed copy of that agreement from President Trump because of my efforts to make it happen. I'm proud that I led the effort here in Texas to get the bullet train between Dallas and Houston past its federal red tape, and have worked to lower your healthcare costs while standing up to this administration when they try to take it away. And I'm proud that I've done that while being endorsed by organizations ranging from the Dallas Morning News and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to labor groups like the AFL-CIO and SEIU. The choice in this election is clear. I have a record of bipartisan accomplishments and have received a 95% rating from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for my bipartisanship because of my efforts to deliver for this community, because it means so much to me. The challenges that we're facing as a nation and as a community are enormous. Nearly 220,000 Americans are dead. 12 million jobs have been lost, and we are more divided in many ways than we've ever been. People are rightfully worried about the future of their democracy. The stakes in this election couldn't be higher. Your healthcare is on the ballot. How we defeat and recover from this pandemic is on the ballot, and our very democracy is on the ballot. I want what's best for North Texas because the people of North Texas made my life possible, and I look forward to serving you for 2 more years if I have the honor. Thank you so much.
Congressman, you were supposed to get the first question anyway, so let me pose to you the same question I did to Ms. Collins. The Senate Judiciary Committee vote on Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett is expected this week. Should that have waited until after the election?
Yes, it clearly should have waited. And let's talk about the hypocrisy in this situation. With Mitch McConnell saying 11 months out from an election that President Obama could not fill a Supreme Court seat. But now that we are having millions of Americans having already voted and just days away from Election Day, trying to rush through a Supreme Court justice instead of doing the pandemic relief that we know needs to be done. And so, yes, absolutely, they should let the American people weigh in. We should listen to the voters, see who they choose to be the next president of the United States, who they choose to be in the next Senate and in the next Congress of the United States, and then move forward. Because there are some things that even if you can do it, causes so much damage to our democracy that it's not worth doing. And this is one of those situations where when you take a Supreme Court seat that was held open unnecessarily and unconstitutionally, in my opinion, and then you ram through another one in the midst of an election, that you do so much damage to the institution of the Supreme Court and to our overall separation of powers that you diminish the nation as a whole. I think the responsible thing to do here is to let the American people weigh in, let them vote, and then let's fill the seat.
Let me raise this question quickly since Ms. Collins brought it up. You support calls by some Democrats to expand the high court if Joe Biden wins, packing it, as some call it, to include more Democrats?
Well, the only people who are packing the courts is Mitch McConnell, who held open hundreds of appellate judge seats, who held open a Supreme Court seat just to rush them through for President Trump. So that's who's been trying to pack the courts. It's not something that I have ever supported, but I also have a reverence for the Supreme Court. I believe that it should be separate and independent from our politics. And what they're doing right now is making it into just another political organ. And it's going to make it harder for all of us to have respect for the court's rulings, for all of us to understand that it's not just acting in a partisan interest, it's not in the interest of the country. And I wish that leaders in Washington would put the country's interests first before their partisan desires.
Okay, let's move on with the question I was going to ask you for the first question. When I moderated a debate with you and Pete Sessions 2 years ago, when you were making your first run for this seat, I brought up the issue of excessive police violence against Black Americans at the time. That problem continues. George Floyd, of course, Tatiana Jefferson in Fort Worth a year ago last week, most recently Jonathan Price in Wolf City, to name a few. And just a little quick thing here, because Ms. Collins brought it up. Do you support defunding the police or not?
Well, no, I do not support defunding the police, and I've never said that. And you know, it's politicians like Ms. Collins who make it difficult for us to actually make any progress to try and restore the relationship between our police and our communities of color.
Well,
And
let's just take that as a no, you don't support defunding the police. I want to get on with really what my question was.
Okay, go ahead.
Neither of you supports defunding the police, as you say, but do you think police reform is needed? And if so, how could you as a member of Congress help address that issue?
Well, we do need to have reform, and we do need to have reforms that try and both provide more resources to the police where needed, and also take some of the responsibilities that should not be in their hands off their plate so they don't have to deal with those things. In the Congress, we've passed legislation to try and take steps towards restoring the relationship between our police and our communities of color. It begins with accountability, because we must have accountability, but it also has additional money for training, for body cameras and the storage of body camera footage. It bans things like chokeholds and no-knock warrants. These are some of these things that Dallas has already done on its own and that we want to make national. But let's also talk about who's actually working to defund the police, because my opponent mentioned that we passed, and I voted for, $600 million in additional funding for our local police in the first HEROES Act. That's additional funding. And Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate said no. They said, we're not going to take that up. And they demanded that we come back with a much lower figure. And so there was never any funding provided. Other than that, I voted to actually add funding, and Mitch McConnell said no. The only folks who are really defunding the police are the Republicans in the Senate, who are going to deny state and local aid to our governments that are facing huge budget shortfalls. And they're going to have to make deep cuts to our police and to our public safety. That is defunding the police, is when you don't cover these budget shortfalls, and then they have to take people and officers off of the street and have to make deep cuts to our public services. That's when you defund the police, not what we've done.
Ms. Collins, your view on police reform and what you could do maybe as a member of Congress if you're elected to help bring that about.
Well, Sam, what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Americans, African Americans in our community should have never have happened. It should have been avoidable, and that there has been bias in law enforcement in actually applying equal protection under the law. All of that needs to change. It's imperative that we have police reform, and it's why I'm grateful that I've spent the entire summer working with our Dallas Black leaders, in addition to the Dallas Police Association, listening to what they really need and learning how we really knit the fabric of our community back together. Dallas has led in terms of getting rid of chokeholds. They abandoned those in 1984, but that needs to be systematic and consistent across the entire country. We need to have a federal registry for bad cops. There are so many good cops that are pillars in our community, and we've got to make sure their voices are lifted up so that way we don't actually have more bad cops inflicting unnecessary pain on other Americans. We've got to have that registry. And the reality is that my opponent voted, period, to defund the police by $600 million. While he may try to pass the buck to the Senate, the reality is he votes with Nancy Pelosi 100% of the time. And she took that bill, she took $600 million out of the bill. So it begs the question, does my opponent really respect our law enforcement as heroes? It seems to me that that's not the case.
Let me piggyback on something you said. I'm curious, when you talk about bad cops as the problem, do you see that as the root of this whole problem with excessive police violence, maybe individual bad apples as opposed to, or maybe a systemic form of racism at work?
Well, Sam, I believe that there is racial bias, and that's something that we as a nation are having a conscious conversation about that needs to happen. And it's imperative that our police officers uphold the law, because the Constitution states that every American is created equal. And if anyone says otherwise, then they're obviously not following our Constitution and they're not applying the law properly. And so I absolutely believe that there's racial bias that needs to be changed, and that it's imperative that we really focus on meaningful conversations that, like I say, knit the fabric of our community back together, that we support each other instead of defund each other. And that's the reality of what this Congress has done.
Sam,
Congressman Allred.
yeah, let me jump in there, because, you know, it's interesting. I'm glad that my opponent read the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, because she just named a whole bunch of the things that we put in that bill as being necessary to get done. So, I mean, I'm glad that she read that. I'm glad that I voted for it and was part of crafting that legislation. But you can bring up the $600 million. We added that funding and Mitch McConnell wouldn't take it up. So it doesn't make any sense to try and say that's defunding the police. Just be honest with people. People know that that's not true. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, so no, I don't think that's the right approach to take. But also, you've been fear mongering throughout this campaign about not only me, but also what's going to happen if I get reelected, that I'm going to try and defund the police. You've darkened my skin in mailers. That's not who we are here in North Texas. And so I think you should be responsible for what you've done in your advertisements as well. Because I don't think that reflects the attitude that I'm hearing here tonight.
Congressman, I'll give you
One quick follow-up, Sam. I do think that it's important to recognize that Tim Scott's police bill was not taken up by the House, and that was put out forth in like late June, and the House voted not to take up Tim Scott's police reform bill. So it seems that the House is equally as culpable in this regard.
Congressman?
We passed legislation in the House, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which has in that act many of the things that you just said: a registry for bad cops, banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants, adding funding for training to reduce implicit bias, adding funding for body cameras and body camera storage and of the footage. I mean, that's what we put in that legislation, and it's smart legislation that should have been taken up. But unfortunately, there were too many politicians who understood that this was a good wedge issue for them, and that they could use this. They could use this fear. They could use this issue to pit us against each other, instead of taking advantage of what I saw in North Texas, which was a multiracial, multi-generational movement of folks walking in the streets from the wealthiest parts of Dallas to all over, saying that they wanted to have change. And that was an act of hope. And that was an act of hope that we should have taken advantage of. And I wish that the Republicans in the Senate and President Trump would have joined us in trying to find a solution to actually get something done. I think we will with President Biden.
Okay, let's move on to a viewer question, somewhat related here maybe. The national conversation around issues of racial equity is impacting policy discussions on all levels of government. How do you define racial equity, and what do you think government needs to do to realize your vision of racial equity? Congressman, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, racial equity means that everyone has an equal shot. And right now, that's not the case. I believe that government doesn't create outcomes, but it can create opportunities by extending ladders of opportunity and making sure that those ladders are in place to make sure that, you know, if the next Einstein is sitting in one of our Dallas public schools right now, that she has everything she needs to become that. And that begins with targeted measures to try and address, yes, some of these systemic issues that have faced our nation for centuries, but also just fundamental common sense things like having access to healthcare. You know, this administration that my opponent supports is actively right now trying to take healthcare away from over 20 million Americans and rip away protections for pre-existing conditions from over 100 million more Americans. That's what they're doing right now. That's just a fact. It also means investing in education and having great teachers. I know from personal experience that we don't pay our teachers enough, and that it's hard to recruit and retain and keep the best teachers in the world, which is what we need. So we know that's the most fundamental thing. But it also means making sure that nobody is discriminated against along the way. And this is something that this president has consistently attacked people who speak differently, who come from different backgrounds, has pitted Americans against each other, has refused to denounce white nationalists marching through the streets of Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us, who's refused to even tell white nationalists who are supporting him to do anything other than stand back and stand down. I mean, that's not who we are. We need real leadership in this country. And we need it also from our members of Congress. And the way my opponent has conducted her campaign indicates to me that she can't be part of that solution.
Ms. Collins, how do you define racial equity, and what do you think the government needs to do to realize your vision of racial equity?
Well, Sam, racial equity means that everyone has an equal opportunity to be prepared for the same thriving future and realize the dreams that they have for themselves. Having spent my career working in education and working with school districts, every school district that make up our congressional district, in addition to other huge school districts like Memphis and Miami-Dade and New York City public schools, what I know is that every child deserves to be prepared for the same thriving future that they will inherit. I have worked and have written legislation 4 years ago to ensure that every child has access to consistent broadband, Wi-Fi, and a device, because we know that the internet and what distance learning now is today because of coronavirus is a huge missed opportunity for Americans to ensure that every child matters and that they all get a great education. I fundamentally support every American having access to quality and affordable health care. And I will fight to ensure that every person with a pre-existing condition has access to, is protected under the law. And I will also ensure that we have opportunity zones that will uplift minority communities, and that we continue to give African American and Latino business owners more access to working capital so that they can too realize their American dreams, because that's how we all win together.
Okay, Ms. Collins, next question goes to you. Regarding COVID-19, has President Trump mismanaged the response to the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, Sam, I think the reality is the federal government unleashed the full power of their resources, ensuring that small and mid-sized and all companies have access to PPP and SBA loans. But right now, this Congress continues to play party line politics and partisan politics, because stalling economic relief for those most needed. One life gone from this virus is one life too many. My campaign has taken this virus very seriously from the beginning. And most recently, I spent the last 2 weeks in the hospital undergoing emergency surgeries. And I had to wait 14 hours to get a COVID test while having appendicitis. The reality is what we need to be doing for coronavirus is making sure that we not only have access to tests, but really making sure that we have faster processing for test results. No one should wait a week long to get the results back of their test. We have to ensure that these tests are more accurate. There are far too many false positives that are happening. That's what my surgeons, doctors, and phenomenal frontline nurses all said to me over these last 2 weeks. There are far too many false positives. We've got to make sure that we're protecting the folks that we know are most susceptible: the elderly, people with pre-existing conditions, and minority communities with multi-generational folks living at home. We need to over-resource these folks with healthcare, and we need to make sure that our businesses get another round of PPP and SBA loans, because they are barely hanging on because this Congress continues to play partisan politics.
Congressman Allred.
Well, you notice that Ms. Collins did not answer the question. The question was whether or not Donald Trump has mismanaged the response to this pandemic. And the answer is clearly yes. We are 4% of the world's population and 20% of the deaths. We lead the world in COVID cases. Over 8 million Americans have caught this virus now. We're approaching 220,000 dead, 12 million jobs lost. And he still is telling people and making fun of people for wearing masks, holding super spreader events for his campaign where he invites people to stand close to each other and not wear masks, even after having the virus, telling people not to take it seriously. I mean, this is a lack of leadership, and it absolutely has caused this pandemic to be so much worse here than it was around the world. South Korea and the United States had our first case on the same day, January 21st. They've lost around 400 members of their country. We are now past 220,000. And we've had a vastly different experience because we didn't have leadership in place that told us the truth from the very beginning. We know what we need to do. We need to dramatically ramp up our testing. We're doing about 900,000 tests a day right now. We should be doing 4 million tests a day. We need to ramp up our contact tracing to make sure that if we identify someone who's tested positive, that we reach as many people as possible and prevent it from spreading, and help them quarantine and isolate. We can hold this virus down even before we get to the vaccine that we all are hoping for. That's what they've done in New Zealand. That's what they've done around the world. But it takes leadership telling folks how to protect themselves and their family.
On a related note, Congress and the White House still can't agree on a stimulus bill. Should there be another, and what should it include, Congressman?
Well, I'm pushing very hard for another stimulus bill, and I was very disappointed when the president tweeted that he was going to pull out of the negotiations and say, let's just focus on the Supreme Court, because we desperately need to have another bill. But let's be very clear about what's happened here. In May, the House passed the HEROES Act, which had $3.4 trillion in desperately needed aid, because we knew what the summer was likely going to look like. And the Senate and Mitch McConnell said, we're not going to do anything. We're going to take a pause. That's what he said specifically. And he paused, and the pandemic got worse and worse, and the economic crisis deepened and deepened. And so then we came back and said, okay, if that's too much for you, we'll pass a $2.2 trillion package, HEROES Act, the second HEROES Act that we just passed a couple of weeks ago. And they still have not taken up that piece of legislation or even offered an alternative. And right now, if we were to strike an agreement, Mitch McConnell's saying he wouldn't put it up in the Senate. So, I mean, my opponent can try to place this on the House, but we have consistently put forward legislation passed in the House trying to address this crisis, trying to expand PPP, trying to have a national plan for testing and dealing with this virus, trying to support our state and local governments because we know the crisis they're going to be facing. We've done this twice now and tried to bend over backwards to come down and reach a number that would be amenable. And we just have not had a partner willing to work with us.
Let me throw this extra question to you, and Ms. Collins, I'll give you extra time to address both questions. We know we've heard American Airlines recently announced 19,000 furloughs and layoffs. Southwest says pay cuts will happen next year, all because federal payroll protection money ran out. Do you favor an extension? Congressman.
Is this for me, Sam?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, okay. Well, listen, this is one of my top priorities. And we tried to extend this twice in the last couple of weeks. We did it in Heroes 2.0. This is the Paycheck Support Program, for those who don't know. It just keeps folks in the airline industry on in their jobs and keeps them employed through this crisis, because we know that the airlines are seeing about 30% of the traffic that they normally have. And that is not going to come back until we beat this virus. So we passed it in Heroes 2.0. And then after that, we tried to pass it through unanimous consent on the floor of the House. And the Republicans, again, objected and said that they wouldn't allow us to pass it through unanimous consent. So we tried twice in the last month to extend this PSP program. And it is one of my top priorities. And I'm going to keep working to make sure that we get it done. I've worked very closely with American Airlines and with Southwest Airlines here in North Texas. I appreciate their importance for our economy. They are critical for us, not only them, but also Love Field and DFW are enormous economic engines for us. I am thankful that they've worked so closely with me to let me understand exactly what they need and how we can work to make that happen. What we need now is to make sure that the legislation that we passed in the House is sitting there right now for the Senate to pick up that would extend PSP, or we could just pass a standalone, and I hope we can do that. But we cannot go through the end of the year without doing this.
Ms. Collins, and you'll get some extra time here to address both questions. Should there be another stimulus bill? What should it include? And do you support the extension for payroll support for airlines?
Well, Sam, there should absolutely be another stimulus bill. I've talked to small business owners since this pandemic has started, whether it's Nikki J at Absolutely Edible Cakes in Rowlett, who didn't get PPP funding, and as well as essential companies like my friend Howard at the Kosher Palette, who was able to get PPP funding. People are struggling, and our Washington politicians are playing partisan politics. I do not believe that a state like Texas should be paying for states like California and New York, who have failed their communities and their states by not passing a budget and not being fiscally responsible and good stewards of their own budget. Why should the federal government and Texans who do things right bail out states that fail? That's unacceptable, and I think that most Texans would agree. The reality is that we also have to ensure that small businesses or any business of that kind has liability protections. Because this pandemic was very unexpected, no company should be held liable for the loss of people's jobs. That is something that certainly we shouldn't be arguing about. We should absolutely pass liability protections. And this Congress continues to say that it will support legislation, but again, it defunds the police by $600 million. It has enormous spending limits. $3 trillion is a lot of money. $3 trillion. That is a lot of money with a lot of pork stuffed in. I do believe my brother-in-law, whom I love, works at Southwest Airlines. Absolutely, the aerospace field is something that's imperative and a huge industry sector in our community. And we've got to make sure that there's protections for these folks. It's through no fault of their own, but we've got to get people moving and traveling again. We also have to make sure our American Airlines and Southwest Airlines are protected.
Let's move on here. While Jews make up the largest target of religiously based hate crimes, Muslims are the fastest growing in that category. and Black Americans are the most frequent overall victims of bias-motivated crimes. Do you support legislation like the No Hate Act to counter it? And what other steps do you feel are needed to combat bias-motivated crimes? Ms. Collins.
Well, every American, like I said earlier, Sam, should be treated equally under the eyes of the law. We should not be having conversations around the fact that we as a nation harbor hate towards our brothers and sisters just because they share a different faith. I fully support religious freedom and allowing anyone, whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or any other religion, being able to practice your religion as you see fit. I think that it's important that we have meaningful, robust conversations like we're having now. These are challenging and really tough conversations that we need to be having, but it's time that we actually create meaningful conversations around this. I'm not sure we can legislate hate. It's something that we have to snuff out. And as a culture, we've got to be responsible to each other. It's hard to legislate culture, in my opinion. The reality is that we have got to choose to be better, to stand up for our fellow brothers and sisters, and recognize that we are, as Americans, are better when we support each other and when we reduce our hate and our bias. And that's what we need to make sure that we're legislating, this bias in terms of police reform, in terms of any opportunity where someone will not be held equally in the eyes of the law.
Congressman Allred.
Well, we can't legislate people's mindsets, but we can protect people. And that's what the legislation that we're talking about intends to do. Trying to protect people that if something happens to them, that it will be considered a hate crime. But we also need to have leadership that stands up when there are those in our society and in our country who try to pit us against each other, who try to divide us. And unfortunately, this Republican Party led by this president has consistently pitted Americans against each other, has consistently tried to find those seams in our democracy, those seams in our country, and pull them apart. And that is one of the reasons why we're seeing a rise in so many hate crimes. The rise is not happening on its own. It wasn't happening during the Obama administration. We've seen a huge increase in hate crimes throughout this time. We've seen a huge increase in the groups that are responsible for these things, forming and organizing online. And there's a reason why they're all supporting President Trump. It's because they see in him actions and policies that they support, that they think further their agenda. And so, yes, we need to have specific and targeted legislation to deal with this. We also need to have leaders who will put an end to this, who will, yes, understand that we might have come here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. That's the North Texas that I know. That's the North Texas that I grew up in. I think that's who we are here in this community. And we need to have leaders in Congress who will stand up to anyone who is peddling that. And that's what I've tried to do in my first term, and certainly will try to do if I have the honor of continuing to serve.
Next question goes to
Sam, can I just make
a quick rebuttal?
Yeah, just super quick. I do think that one of the things that we have to do as a Congress in the next session is actually look at big tech and how big tech drives a wedge between us all. The last time that there was any accountability for big tech was in 1996. And as we were seeing is that the advent and the rise of social media is creating a further divide in who we are as Americans. And now we're unable to have conversations. I think it's imperative that we look at big tech and hold them accountable, make them transparent. They can't solve these problems with machine learning. They shouldn't be trying to solve these problems. We need to have oversight and regulatory agency look at this and really start solving these problems from a technology standpoint. And I think that will help, like I said, knit the fabric of our community back together and have us make conversation again.
Congressman, do you need a 40-second rebuttal?
I mean, I certainly agree that we need to have a regulation of our tech companies. I don't think it's the tech companies themselves that are entirely the problem. The problem is that they provide platforms that are then allowing these groups to organize, and that they're taking their fuel and their fire from the leadership that they're getting. And so, yes, that's a part of the conversation that we need to have, but it's certainly not even close to being the largest problem that we're facing here. When we're talking about hate, we're talking about bias, when we're talking about what's happening in our country right now.
Okay, Congressman, in recent years, the relationship between the United States and European democracies has suffered strains. Is it important that we sustain the United States' historic post-World War II partnership with Europe, or is it time to rethink this relationship?
Well, it absolutely is that we need to lean into these relationships. We should be working even more closely with our European allies. The post-World War II order that has kept the world largely out of another world war was put together by us. These are our institutions. And this president has walked away from all of them or questioned them or said that they don't serve a purpose anymore. And the rest of the world is looking at us. I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I can tell you, the rest of the world is looking at us and wondering, is this who the United States is going to be going forward? Are we going to cozy up to dictators and folks and strongmen around the world while also stiff-arming the democracies that we have traditionally always worked with? I mean, we are so far past anything that we've ever seen from any Republican or Democratic president previously on foreign policy. We have so far abandoned our fundamental American values that it's frankly embarrassing, and we cannot have an extension of it. But I'm running for a re-election to Congress, and part of what Congress has to do is reassert our role in foreign policy. And that's what we've tried to do during this first term, is to try and reassert our constitutional role in the making and conduct of war, constitutional role in what we do abroad, and the values that we have, and how we hold up a light for those values and let the rest of the world follow us, because it's our values. That's why the world follows us, not because of our economy or our military. It's what we stand for, and that's what we have to protect.
Ms. Collins?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. In recent years, the relationship between the United States and European democracies has suffered strains. Is it important that we sustain the United States' historic post-World War II partnership with Europe, or is it time to rethink this relationship?
The United States is a beacon of hope for all countries because we allow so many freedoms rightly given to all of us as natural citizens. The reality is, though, is that many of our European allies haven't been carrying their fair share of the load. I do think that it's high time that we have a real conversation and hold NATO accountable. For example, the United States has been largely paying the sum of supplying defense to NATO countries. Now, NATO has helped us in our endless war that it is time to get out of, but we've got to hold these other nations accountable to pay their fair share. American taxpayers are generous, but we don't need to be the world police, and we don't need to be paying for all of it. It's important that we stand for diplomatic relationships at the UN. I'm super on board with what Ambassador Nikki Haley did, standing with Israel unwaveringly. And now this administration has actually shown that we can have peace in the Middle East, strengthening bonds with other nations across the Middle East, which is a very unstable region with Israel. We've got to, as a nation, though, lead when it comes to China, because whether it's European allies or here at home, we've got to make sure that we're standing up and being tough on China, because they're our adversary and not our foe. I'm disappointed that this congressman hasn't stood up to the Chinese Communist Party for all of their culpability during his term.
Congressman, do you need a rebuttal?
Sure. Well, I'm having a hard time understanding how my opponent would say we need to hold NATO accountable. I was in Afghanistan last year over Thanksgiving, visiting our troops at Bagram Air Force Base and at our embassy there. You know who's defending and fighting with us in Afghanistan? NATO. There's only one time in the history of NATO's existence that the mutual defense provision has been enacted. That was after 9/11 to defend us. We have the country of Georgia doing base defense in Afghanistan. You have the British there. You have the French, you have the Germans. I mean, we don't need to hold NATO accountable for anything, okay? Yes, NATO can do things better. But this is a fundamental pillar of how we've kept the world safe. And to question that, I think really throws into question my opponent's understanding of our foreign policy.
Next question goes to Ms. Collins. Turning to Israel and the Middle East, do you support a two-state solution to the warming relations between Israel and neighbors like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain give you reason to be optimistic about the possibility of resolving this long-standing conflict? And what do you believe the role of the United States should be in achieving peace as a member of Congress? How would you help to advance your vision of that role?
Well, there should absolutely be hope and optimism for what's happening in the Middle East. We're seeing this Middle Eastern region starting to want to be more stabilized, starting to want peace. and that's through brokering peace deals with Israel. It's important that as Americans, we stand up for Israel. We finally moved our embassy to Jerusalem, something that President Bill Clinton signed into law, but every president has kicked the can down the line until just recently. We've got to show our support to Israel. The UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, like I just said previously, she stood up and voted with Israel every time when our allies diplomatically would abandon Israel. This is something that we as a nation have to have resolve and always stand for Israel. I am 100% behind a two-state solution. I think that Israel is open to the negotiating table. Obviously, they're doing it with multiple nations. Palestine should be no different. I think that Palestine has to, as a government, look to get away from harboring terrorist organizations like Hamas and really look to having free and fair trade amongst Israel and Palestine. I do not support the BDS movement. I think that it is flawed and it is absolutely terrible for Israel. And I think that there is real hope and optimism for Israel, but we have got to always stand on behalf of our Israel partners and our Israel relationships.
Congressman?
Well, it's clear that Israel is one of our most important allies in the region and in the world. We don't just have a military alliance, we have a shared common values and bond that I think is critical that we continue to maintain. But it's also clear that the only way forward for Israel and for Palestinians is a two-state solution in which both have security and autonomy. And I think that is the only way that we're going to end up with a long-term peace in the region. And I welcome the agreements between Israel and Bahrain and UAE, normalizing their relations. Those are good first steps. I've been saying for months, and some of the folks who I work with here who care passionately about the U.S.-Israel relationship know that we've had this conversation as far back as last year, that the Gulf states were a great chance for us to move forward and to form some really strong relationships because they're worried about Iran, because they want to have an ally in their fight against Iran. And so that leverage point is what's allowing us to move forward with some of these agreements. And it is a good starting point. But the fundamental issue will always remain the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And we have to have a solution. When I went to Israel last year and was honored to do that and met with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas, it was clear to me that the United States is not going to dictate the terms of whatever agreement they reach. That's not going to be our role. What we can do is try to create the conditions in which that agreement can be reached. And that's what I think we all, on a bipartisan basis, have to continue to work towards.
Congressman, we'll start this next question with you. The Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign against Israel purports to promote Palestinian rights, but does so by denying Israel's legitimacy, refusing dialogue, and advocating for Israel's destruction. If elected to Congress or re-elected to Congress, what, if anything, would you say to those who deny Israel's legitimacy and advocate for an end of the world's only Jewish state?
Well, thank you. I was proud to co-sponsor and vote for a resolution in the House condemning the BDS movement because of that reason that you just laid out, that it's trying to delegitimize the state of Israel. That resolution passed the House 398-17. So it passed overwhelmingly. This is not a live issue in our politics. No one serious is supporting and supportive of this movement. And we have to continue to make sure that we support and tamp down efforts like this that try to delegitimize Israel because of the story, because of the Jewish diaspora, because of the need for a Jewish homeland. It's even more sinister and worse to try and go after it through means like this. But again, we still have to continue to push for and create the conditions so that we can remove some of the stimulus for these efforts. And the stimulus is driven by the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And so that's what we all have to continue to work towards, is how do we create the conditions in which leaders can arise among the Palestinians and in Israel that can find an agreement. I think it's possible. And I think that we're moving closer to it. But the US has to play a productive role in that. And I think it too many times, this administration has made it too difficult for us to be that equal arbiter.
Ms. Collins.
Well, I'd just like to point out that, again, my opponent is trying to take credit for someone else's good work, trying to ensure that we don't have BDS happening here in our nation or try to stomp it out abroad. Again, my opponent has passed 0 bills while he's been in office and is, again, another largely ineffective party line politician. But I believe that BDS is a violation of free and fair trade. As a nation, this is something that we need to always be a beacon of light for. And I think that most Palestinians, even the Palestinians that live here in the district that are our friends, that are our neighbors, they don't support the terror that's being harbored, the boycott of Israel products. It's imperative that we bring together Israel and Palestine in a productive working relationship where both can coexist peacefully, because this administration has proven that that can happen with UAE or Bahrain or a number of host of other countries that are ready, willing, and able to start normalizing relations in the Middle East. We cannot, period, have BDS, and that's something that I will always fight for, and I will be the tip of the spear for all of our Israel friends to ensure that it never happens.
Before we go,
Sam, I have to say something, Sam. I mean,
quickly.
I don't know what more you can do in the Congress than co-sponsor and vote for a piece of legislation. I mean, that is the definition of putting your support behind something. So I'm not taking credit for anyone else's work. I'm telling you what I did. What I did was co-sponsor and vote for legislation opposing and condemning BDS. So, I mean, these kind of gimmicks, I don't think it's really worthy of a debate for a position as serious as this, to try and say that doing that means that you're trying to take credit for someone else's work. I mean, let's move past that kind of stuff, please.
Ms. Collins,
I believe that we sent
very
you
good.
and sent you to do a job. You have yet to pass a single bill that you have authored or written. I think that is a failure on your part and completely ineffective, and just voting with Nancy Pelosi 100% of the time.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because let's have a discussion. And Sam, I think you can allow this, right?
No, actually, there's another subject I need to get in before we.
Come on, Sam, you have to let me respond to that.
I gotta move on here because we're running short on time here. Okay, listen, and I'm saying this because we've gotten a number of questions from viewers about this. So, with the Affordable Care Act going before the U.S. Supreme Court again soon, we could soon need a legislative fix to our nation's healthcare system. How would you propose ensuring the maximum number of Americans are covered and that no one's penalized for having a pre-existing condition, especially given the more than 8 million Americans who now have the pre-existing condition of COVID-19? Ms. Collins, let's start with you.
Well, first off, thank you for the question, Sam, and I'd like to address some blatant lies that my opponent has been broadcasting on his television ads. I do not support getting away with pre-existing conditions. I will always fight and ensure that I'll never sign on to any piece of legislation that would remove protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I personally know so many people that have pre-existing conditions, both friends and family. I would never want to strip away their rights. I also believe that the way to reduce drug prices is actually through price transparency, not price fixing. Price transparency means that we're going to have more informed consumers that will be able to ask questions and be able to hold Big Pharma accountable. Price fixing, which is what my opponent is in favor of, is going to create a price ceiling which will then result in a race to the bottom, moving out generic drugs and not closing the loopholes for Big Pharma. I want to close the loopholes for Big Pharma for reconstituting drugs and reformulating their patents and squeezing out generics. I want to also ensure that we don't have trade-offs, that what price fixing would do is reduce the amount of innovation for drugs that need cures. That is what price fixing would do. That is what HR 3 will do and what my opponent is in favor of. So I will repeat this, I will never take away anyone's right to healthcare for a pre-existing condition. And I will very much use my business experience to ensure that we have reduced drug prices.
Congressman?
Well, thank you, Sam. This is one of the most important questions facing us, because as you said, it's very likely that the Supreme Court may strike down the Affordable Care Act, and we will be stuck asking, what are we going to do next? Because right now, the way we protect folks with pre-existing conditions is through the ACA by requiring insurance companies to not only cover them, but to not discriminate against them. And that's the key point, because you can have coverage that's just coverage that you can't afford, and that doesn't work. What the ACA did was require that not only do you get that coverage, but that you won't be discriminated against. My opponent right now on her website says she wants to repeal the ACA. She supports Donald Trump, whose administration is currently, right now, as we speak, in court trying to repeal the ACA. You know, the only entity at the federal level that's defending the ACA in court right now is the House of Representatives, because of the resolution that I introduced and passed on my first day in Congress. And so it's just completely inconsistent to say that you both want to get rid of the ACA and protect folks with pre-existing conditions, because that's how we protect folks with pre-existing conditions. When it comes to drug costs, you know, I'm on the Veterans Affairs Committee. You know, the VA negotiates drug prices to hold down their costs. That's what we're trying to allow Medicare to do, to negotiate drug prices. Transparency alone is not going to do it. Just knowing how much a drug costs when you have no other option and they're gouging you isn't going to do it. For Shane, who I met from Garland, who has a good job but can't afford her insulin, it's not going to work for her. When 1 in 4 Americans can't afford their insulin, that's not going to work. You can't just have price transparency. You need leverage. You need the leverage of the government on your side to try and control costs only in certain areas. And let's also stress this, because it's only in certain medications that this would apply to, where there is no generic competitor, where there is no competitor to hold down costs, where the market cannot do it on its own, where there's price gouging occurring. That's where we would negotiate and hold down costs for everyone.
And with that, we'll need to move on to closing statements. So Ms. Collins, first one goes to you.
Well, first off, Sam, thank you for moderating, and to the AJC, thank you for hosting. And Mr. Allred, thank you for joining me tonight. And to all of you viewers, thank you for tuning in. As you've seen tonight, we have a clear choice. You have a proven business leader who will work to create jobs and ensure that you have quality and affordable healthcare, versus a party line politician who hasn't passed a single bill. I will use my business experience creating jobs, balancing a budget, and forecasting growth. I will ensure that every child is prepared for a thriving future. And I will also fight to make sure that every North Texan has access to quality and affordable healthcare. I'm not just from Dallas. I'm not just born and raised here. I've actually built a business here, and I've worked with every school district that makes up this congressional district. And I understand the nuances of our neighborhoods and will always be a champion for your voices. I look forward to being your voice and to be the tip of the spear and truly solve problems for our district. I thank you. I ask for your vote. I ask for your support, and I ask for your prayers. Thank you.
Congressman Allred.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you to AJC and Temple Shalom for hosting us. As you've heard, we do have some very real differences of opinion between us. And those differences are rooted in our experiences. You know, my opponent and I grew up just a short distance from each other, but miles apart in our experiences. I know what it's like to have to fight for everything that you've ever had. I know the challenges that North Texas families are facing right now. And that's why I've fought so hard to find common ground and bipartisan solutions like the VA hospital and like the USMCA trade agreement. You know, my opponent likes to say that I'm a party line politician. Well, that's not what the US Chamber of Commerce said when they endorsed me. They gave me a 95% bipartisan rating. And so my opponent's trying to cherry pick statistics and lead you to believe something that's just not true. You have to ask yourself, who do you believe? Independent organizations like the Dallas Morning News Editorial Board and the US Chamber of Commerce, who've looked at us and made a recommendation that I continue in the service that I've been doing? Or my opponent, who obviously has a self-interest in trying to get elected? I don't think that that's the route that we should go, but I also think it's how we should conduct ourselves in a campaign like this. And so it's been the honor of my life to represent this community. I want to thank you so much for that chance. And I ask for you to give me a chance to continue to serve you in the Congress.
Thanks to both of our candidates. Also, as a reminder, our sponsoring organizations are all nonpartisan 501c3 organizations that neither endorse nor oppose candidates for office. Early voting is open until October 30th, and Election Day is November 3rd. On behalf of our hosts, I'd like to urge everyone to go out and vote. Also, thank you to the candidates, of course, for participating in this important and timely debate, and to our audience for taking the time to hear directly from the candidates. Thanks again for being here. Good night.
Good night.